views on what makes an action moral or immoral and why. And today I'd like to talk to you about that, because we kind of all have different views on what makes an action moral or immoral. Generally, though, the way that we act in society, when we judge other people, when we say you should have done something, we seem to be invoking some objective standard of right and wrong that we have in our minds. Like, that is wrong. It doesn't matter if you're living in China. It doesn't matter if it was 100 years ago and times have changed. There seem to be things that are just wrong, right? Regardless of time, place, culture. Usually, morality is taken to be objective, universal, and having a certain force, such that, look, regardless of whether or not you're going to benefit from the action, or your family is, or whether or not it fulfills one of your personal goals that you set for yourself, morality just seems to have a certain force. You ought to do the good thing, perhaps even if it comes at significant cost to you. Objective, meaning it isn't just, we made it up arbitrarily and it can change on a whim. But we seem to usually be invoking this standard we have that applies to all people at all times and places. Now, there are views that don't agree to this, but we'll talk about them later. The first view that we're going to look at is one that is principled, one that you might find intuitive. This one is called deontology. It's the view that the morality of an action is determined by whether or not we're fulfilling our duty. And I'm not going to write this whole phrase at the beginning every time, but Kant is famous for arguing for a kind of morality like this. He thought that the only completely good thing was the will. Whether or not your action is moral or immoral depends on your will, or in other words, your intentions. Kant's deontological view is very principled. He thought, look, if you want to figure out how to live a moral life, you need to use your reasoning capacities to access this objective standard. We can get to it through reason. And a test for figuring out whether or not what you're going to be doing is moral or immoral can be done in a few different ways. These are what he called the formulations of the categorical imperative. He thought that all actions flow from principles that we have. So we need to make sure our principles have certain features or characteristics. The first test that he devised, the first formulation of the categorical imperative, says, act in such a way that you always use humanity as an end, never merely as a means. So how do you test if your principle is going to lead to moral actions? Well, you try to conceive of a world in which everybody had to do that thing, as if your principle was a universal law of nature. If you run into practical or logical problems imagining such a world, bad principle. You should toss it out. His second formulation was easier to understand, though. He said, basically, in your actions, never treat another human being merely as an object. So, if I took one of you up here and I treated you like a chair, and I kicked you around and I sat on you and I didn't look at you as a human being, would that be wrong? Kant had a similar intuition. So he thought, because human beings have this thing called reason, they also have inherent value. We should treat them as conscious, valuable beings who have goals and ends in themselves. So, he thought, whether or not an action is moral or immoral is whether or not it fulfills our duty as human beings. We just have certain duties to ourselves, to God, and to other people. Now, Kant's view was very strict. He thought, for example, that suicide was always immoral, that lying was always immoral. Here we can already see a weakness of this view, right? If your girlfriend, right, you're out shopping and she comes out of the dressing booth and she says, "Does this make me look fat?" and it's not very flattering on her, is the moral thing in that situation to be like, "Yeah, you kind of look like a blue whale"? What do you think? No, why? Some of you are shaking your heads. Why? Why would just being brutally honest with her not be the right thing to do, you might think? Yeah. It's mean? What does it do? If she heard that, how would she feel?
Probably pretty bad.
Pretty bad?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want people to be brutally honest with how you look? Oh, you're looking really tired and ugly today. No? Why? Well, because it hurts people's feelings, right? It doesn't make them feel good. You might think, look, okay, Kant's view might be good, but I have a better one. One that's not about the person's intentions. What's another thing we might think makes an action moral or immoral? Not the intentions before the action, but what? Yeah, that could play a role. Think of the girlfriend example. The consequences. Utilitarianism is an alternate view of what makes an action moral or immoral. I'm just going to copy this whole thing. The view that the morality of an action is determined by, I'm just going to use that symbol for that. Utilitarianism and views like it say, no, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. It matters the consequences of the action. Whether or not the action had a certain result that we're gunning for. Like happiness. Whether or not it makes the most people happy. Or pleasure. Or in the literature, sometimes utilitarians will use this term of art called utiles. You can think of utilitarianism as kind of a mathematical ethical theory. Why? Well, because it's going to say, look, the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. What consequences do we care about? Well, people being happy or their well-being, something like that. So we can, in theory, quantify how happy everybody is right now. And whether or not our actions are good is determined by whether we raise the happiness levels in the universe or whether we lower them by causing suffering, by causing pain. What do you think of this view? Is the morality of an action determined by its consequences, or do you think intentions matter more? Yes?
I think they both have a plan to it. Because you can't just really grade it off of either the consequences or the intentions, because both kind of matters.
Both matter, you think? Is there one that matters more than another? No? I walk into class earlier today, let's say, and I'm carrying my hot cup of coffee, and I accidentally spill it on your clothes. Completely accidental. I didn't mean to do that. In fact, I brought the cup of coffee for you. I bought it for you, and I wanted to give it to you. So what I did wrong? I tripped and I accidentally spilled it on you. Your new shirt.
No.
You don't think so?
No.
But my action had bad consequences, right? I just maybe ruined. But my intentions were different, right? Okay, so maybe you think intentions matter more than consequences? What do the rest of y'all think? Yeah?
I think they matter almost equally because if you have the intention of like hurting someone, right, then the consequences of you murdering someone are pretty bad.
Okay.
But if you don't have, the intention of murdering someone, but they come into your house and try to like kill you and you kill them, then the consequences are a little, different.
Okay. And you think, yeah, you might be justified in doing something like that. Yeah?
I'm pretty sure utilitarianism is just like if the ends justify the means, but that can like let you justify a lot of things that you shouldn't. And so it's like a dangerous viewpoint to walk down.
Like what? What kind of views might it justify?
Like torturing one baby to solve world hunger. Because you're like, well, the means are so good that the ends are justified in getting there.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like if we could just torture one baby to death to solve world hunger forever, long term, that's going to solve a lot of problems. That's going to contribute to a lot of happiness, right? So in cases like this, you can justify actions like that. You might think that's a weakness of this view. Maybe you think, yeah, the ends don't always justify the means. Okay. So maybe deontology isn't perfect. Maybe utilitarianism isn't perfect. Well, luckily for us, there are a lot of other views that philosophers have come up with. Let's look at an ancient one for a second. What we might call virtue theory or virtue ethics. What does this view say? Well, formulated by Aristotle thousands of years ago, he argued that morality, being a good person, health, being a healthy person, and happiness all go together. If you want to live a moral, happy, healthy life, basically you need to change your character. You need to work on yourself so that you naturally do good and wise and just things without having to think about it. You just naturally do them. Whether or not it is done. He thought that, look, human life is messy. What we should do if we want to be good people is we need to cultivate certain dispositions, certain character traits. If we work on improving ourselves and perfecting ourselves, developing these things called the virtues, you might think a disposition or a tendency to feel the right way, respond in the appropriate action to what's in front of you, at the proper person, from the proper motive, your action is done to the proper degree of intensity, then what you're doing is good. Good actions flow from a good character. So this is the thing that you need to work on. There aren't any hard and fast rules that always apply. It's just become good and then you'll do good things. Not easy, a little vague, but what do you think about this view? Unlike deontology, which is going to say, look, there are some things that are always immoral, some duties that we always have. We ought to always act like this in every situation. Aristotle's going to say, no, like you got to look at the context. And sometimes it can be tough to figure out what you're supposed to do. But look, that knowledge and understanding is going to come if you just perfect yourself. If you develop your character in such a way that you feel the proper emotions and you respond in the proper way in these situations, you're good. So you got to work on yourself, which means developing your capacities, which means, looking out for your health. And then naturally, you're just going to do good things for yourselves and others. What do we think about this? Better than deontology or utilitarianism, or no? Yeah.
I don't think this is specifically about virtue theory, but when utilitarianism versus deontology was mentioned, I thought of innocence and proven guilty, or the assumption that the best intentions were that actions were done with the best intentions before we call that person guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking maybe that also attributes to virtue theory, in which it's like this person is most likely trying to do their best, but did a bad action.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the path to developing these virtues, like generosity and courage and magnanimity and friendliness and honesty, it's really hard work. Aristotle thought maybe there's a handful of people that is actually completely virtuous alive at any given time. Because it's really hard to cut out those things that are unhealthy for you, to practice doing the right thing. So we might say this theory's vague. It's really hard to follow. Aristotle thought actually that all the virtues go together. You can't just have one and not have the other ones. So what that means is if you don't have one of them, you actually don't have any of them. Because it takes courage to be generous. It takes generosity to be friendly. It takes friendliness to be appropriately honest and not be too honest or not honest enough. What it means to act virtuously, he thought, was to think and act in a balanced way. This was his principle of the golden mean. Courage isn't just rushing into everything without any fear. That's stupidity, and that's rashness. Neither is courage being afraid of everything. It's somewhere in the middle. Golden mean between two extremes. He saw all the virtues like this. But what about this? Isn't this view very self-serving? If you wanted to oversimplify it, you could say this is just what all of those influencers are saying right now, and they're like, yo, you got to work on yourself and lock in, man. Some people have thought virtue theory is overly self-interested. Because it's going to say, like, look, you want to do good things? First, work on yourself. Don't worry about other people. Does that solve any social or economic problems we're having? What do you think?
Well, I think it's kind of a self-serving morality. You're kind of just doing things to serve yourself and feel good about yourself. I feel that, like, under virtue theory, what was it? He said it was integrity, honesty, courage.
Yeah, there's a whole list
respect.
of virtue he gives, yeah.
A lot of schools try and use that for, like, rules to follow, and I just found that it kind of just leads to the demonization of a lot of, like, actions and tendencies, thoughts, feelings. Kind of just demonizes a lot of stuff like that and views it as wrong, sort of.
Okay. Yeah, so, yeah, maybe you do think it's very self-serving. You know, and we should be more outward-facing.
It also seems more focused on long-term benefit. 'Cause
Yeah.
It probably take a while to even get close to getting the virtues, let alone even if you get it.
Yeah. Aristotle said it's extremely hard to become virtuous. And not only that, it requires a bunch of external goods. He says the happy man or the flourishing man is seldom happy. The ugly man is seldom happy. He thought, look, if you don't have friends, if you don't have enough wealth, if you don't have a certain social standing, you're not going to achieve a flourishing life because you don't have what you need to cultivate the virtues. You don't have money to be generous and practice generosity with. You don't have the freedom in your society to actually, work on yourself properly. And that way you might think maybe he's kind of classist or something. He was writing this philosophy primarily for aristocrats. So, okay. Maybe we should be more social and outward facing then. Maybe that's what we should prioritize. That's what's moral. Well, there's a theory that follows those same lines. The feminist ethics of care. These thinkers, like Virginia Held and Nell Nodding, thought, look, throughout the history of philosophy, women's voices haven't been expressed. They've been marginalized from writing and doing and talking about this stuff. Women's experiences haven't been included. There's something really fundamental that all these views are missing. And that's human relationships. So they argued, what makes an action moral or immoral is determined by the degree to which we maintain and strengthen our relationships. The degree to which we meet the needs of those we are responsible for. So, what we're trying to do, if we want to live a moral life, is we want to care for people. Care is a feeling and it's a practice. What it means to properly care for someone is to show up for them. If you're responsible for them in some way, to meet their psychological and physical needs. That's what we should be doing. Because our society right now, care is lacking. Human relationships are not prioritized, but human relationships is what makes this whole thing work. So that's what we need to focus on. Strengthening and maintaining relationships. What do you think about this view? Walker, what do you think?
So I'm kind of thinking back to the girlfriend looking a little big in that outfit.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, maybe I should tell her because I don't want her going out and everyone else thinking the same thing I'm thinking.
Or somebody making fun of her.
Yeah. So I guess it just kind of depends on what you look at as care. More long term.
That's a great question. Here, I'm going to start writing this above so you can see it. Yeah, what does proper care look like? Is it telling your girlfriend that you should change out of that? Because, again, you want to protect her from being made fun of when she goes out. You want to be honest with her. If your friend, if they've kind of turned to a life of drinking, they've been drinking a lot lately because school is tough. They just want to blow off some steam, but they're waking up, almost every day with a hangover. You can see this is kind of becoming a problem. how do you properly care for them? Is it just telling them you're concerned and letting them do what they're going to do? Or is it taking their handle of Captain Morgan away and kidnapping them and putting them in a treatment facility? Somewhere in between? What does proper care look like? Yeah.
Well, like using that situation, I would think like in between, obviously like saying like, hey, I'm concerned, and like obviously like getting them the help. The in between is like, hey, I'm concerned, like I'll like go to like AA with you and like help like set up appointments. Like that's taking proper care.
Okay, so it's not kidnapping them?
No.
How about taking their alcohol away from them? They purchased it.
I think it's just dependent. Well, first of all, how far gone they are, because if you take it away from them, they could end up just injuring themselves, and they could just end up in the hospital due to withdrawal. But like, if
Yeah.
it, I guess you have to kind of know about that. That needs to be prior knowledge that you need to know before you can act.
Okay, but it's somewhere in between there. Yeah.
Wouldn't ideally you be able to determine this through strengthening relationships or through proper relationships with people?
Yeah, hopefully you know enough about them that you know what it would mean to properly care for them in this instance. But it's not always clear, right? Your boyfriend has really started just watching a lot of TikTok lately, and his homework is starting to suffer, his grades are starting to suffer. How do you properly care for him? Is it putting an app on his phone that limits his TikTok time without him knowing? And then when he gets angry about it, you tell him, look, I'm just caring for you. Like, this isn't good for you. You're brain rot. You're getting really, this is bad. Or is it to just let him do what he's going to do? Even if you can see him growing in his addiction to social media. It's not always easy to tell, right? Even people you're really close to. We might think that another weakness is that, kind of like the virtue theory view, it's kind of vague. It doesn't offer hard and clear and fast rules for how to meet people's physical and psychological needs. Would it be immoral, say, if you're a struggling single parent and you don't have the energy to cook because you're going to school and you have a full-time job and you're trying to care for your kid, and half the days of the week you buy him fast food for dinner? Would that be improper care? People are split in this room on this, right? It's not easy to tell. Oh, okay, if you think this view has weaknesses, there are others. We'll look at just a few more. Divine command theory. Has anyone heard of this one? What do you think it means? Divine command theory. Annabelle.
From what I've heard, like in the instances where I've heard it before, it's more just like people kind of mostly excusing their actions, saying that it was like called upon them to do whatever they're doing.
Okay, and how do they justify it, or how do they excuse it?
Like religiously.
Religiously. So what do they invoke? Who do they invoke?
God.
Right. The divine command theorists think that what makes an action moral or immoral is what God wills. God makes the rules. God has determined what's moral or immoral. What do you think about this view? Yeah?
It's probably the weakest one in my opinion.
Why?
Because if God were to do anything, that would then completely change morality.
Like if God changed his mind?
If God's will is what morality is, anything he does will change morality or like make it evident. I mean, you know, in the Old Testament, there's plenty of examples of very harsh things that we probably wouldn't say represent Christian values now.
Like genocide? Like the Israelites wiping people out,
Yeah.
men, women, and children.
Famines, all that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you think, like, look, this kind of makes morality subject to change or like arbitrary in some sense. If it's just what God wills, can't God change his mind? Can't God will something different? And if he did, then wouldn't that mean, for example, though he's willing murder is wrong right now, if he changed his mind, murder would be okay? Yeah.
I think there's also a bad history of divine command theory. You can look at past polytheistic religions like the Greeks, for example, in which they committed a lot of bad things that we view nowadays because of what the gods imply. But another more modern example is definitely when the Protestant Reformation was going around and the heads of state used the church to command the people. And so it's very manipulative.
It can be manipulative. Sure, yeah. Maybe you want to look at history and be like, religion has resulted in a lot of bad stuff sometimes.
It can result in a lot of like morality just being whoever says that they speak for God. So like whether it's, church and state are the same thing, it can make morality just what someone wills it to be if they are the head of that religion.
Okay.
If you're like divine scripture comes through some guy, then he decides what morality is.
Okay. So yeah, you might think that it can be subject to being abused because there is a hierarchical kind of structure within these institutions, right? There are priests or scholars who are seen as authoritative experts on what the scriptures say.
I also think sometimes, I don't know if I would use the word subjective, but I think that sometimes people can be a little bit selective in what they're reading and looking for. Say they're following the gospel, they can kind of like twist it in a way where it's like, oh, this is what he means, but maybe God doesn't mean that at all.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds though like a weakness of people though.
I guess, but it's like they're just using it to kind of back their actions up, but it's like, maybe that's not what it is.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, like, it could be used to justify heinous things. Like those people across the river, they're our enemies. Like, God wants us to kill them. So we're going to go across the river and kill them because, that's what God wants. You'll find that all of these views can be used to justify bad things. For example, deontology. One famous example that gets brought up in the literature is Kant says you're always supposed to be immoral. Lying is always immoral. So if you're protecting your friend in your home and an axe murderer walks up to your door and rings the doorbell and is like, hey, is your friend Jim in here? I want to kill him. Kant would say you have to be moral and tell the truth. You can't lie to the axe murderer. Now, divine command theorists would respond to these. Every proponent of these views come up with arguments to defend their views from these weaknesses and these criticisms. I mean, the traditional response is God's will doesn't change. God isn't some fickle, capricious thing. Yeah.
But also for that theory, like, there's so many different religions. How do you know which God has the right and wrong? Like, different gods say different things are wrong and right. Like, how do you know which one's wrong?
Yeah. If we're talking about divine command theory, how do we choose? Should we follow the gods of Hinduism or the gods of Buddhism or the Presbyterian Christian United States denomination God or the God of Catholicism, the God of Eastern Orthodoxy? Yeah. That's another worry you might have, right? Because it seems like these religions and these gods, if they exist, disagree about how we're supposed to be living. Maybe you don't find any of these views intuitive, though. Maybe you disagree with that. Maybe you don't think morality is objective. Maybe you don't think it is universal. If you didn't believe that, what might you think about morality? I'm thinking of an R word. Think Einstein. Relative. There's some people who are moral relativists. How do you spell that again? What does this view say? Well, it says, look, there's no objective, universal standard of right and wrong that applies to everybody. It's just relative to your culture or your society, your historical context. There's not like this one standard that we're all beholden to, that is objective and outside of us and doesn't depend on us for its existence. Rather, morality is like something that we've come up with. Everybody has different views on it. It's just a product of history and, whatever a culture believes and what they've gone through. So, what's right and wrong in the U.S. is not what's right and wrong for people in South Korea. What's right and wrong for people in, Zimbabwe is not the same as what's right and wrong for people in Canada. There is no one standard that's right and true and more valid than the rest. What do you think about this view? Yeah.
After last class, I was thinking about regular moral theory versus the moral theory of someone who's like sociopathic.
Yeah?
Which we usually think of them as like, they're insane, their views they're not realistic, something's wrong, and so we can't take them as serious. So I would agree to that to an extent. But just that it is in existence that sociopathy just has a different moral perspective.
Yeah? Do you think this view is true? Like, look, there's no one objective standard that applies to us all that is more valid and true than any other.
It captures the complete contextual subjectivity of morality, like how it's across different time spans or different spots across the world, or two people standing next to each other.
Yeah.
And how morality can depend on what they think is moral. Like some guy can be doing what he thinks is the most moral thing possible, but that could be immoral to the rest of the world. But is he following his sense of morality, and is that it? Like, it's completely dependent on so many factors that it's impossible to not think of it as relative.
Yeah, you might think look, the wide variety in beliefs and views that we have about what is moral provide evidence that this is true. You have different views than the people sitting next to you about what's right and wrong. Now, how might somebody respond to that? Well,
they would say there's things that a culture does that still feels objectively immoral. Like slavery was deemed okay in America, but I think looking back, even though that was culturally moral at the time, I don't think anybody would call that moral.
Do y'all think slavery is moral? I'm not seeing anybody nodding, which is good. Yeah, one of the weaknesses of this view is, on it, you would think there's no actual or real moral progress. There's just cultures changing their views over time. But somebody who is deeply committed to relativism would have to say, look, before we were fighting the Civil War in this country, they had rules about what was right and wrong, and relative to those rules, they weren't doing anything wrong. It was legal. Most people seem to agree with it. But looking now, we think that it's wrong, and I bet a lot of you think that it doesn't matter if they thought it was okay back then. Slavery is just wrong. Doesn't depend on what society thinks is right and wrong. Yeah?
How do they explain no progress when, I mean, the example you just brought up, like, they deemed it, like, fair and, like, practiced it back then, but now it's a totally different view, and no one agrees with it.
Yeah. The idea here is that to say that there's real moral progress is to look at what's happening now and compare it to some ideal standard of what's right and wrong. But that's exactly what the moral relativist would reject, like this ideal objective standard. You might think another weakness of this view too is that it doesn't provide us with any basis to judge what other cultures are doing as wrong. They just have different rules, right? It's right and wrong according to them. Is female genital mutilation wrong? Well, in the places where it's practiced, the relativist would say it's right to them. It's wrong according to our standard, but it's not like objectively really wrong. That seems to rub a lot of people the wrong way. Because if every standard is as valid as any other, or as relative as any other, yeah, can we judge or criticize or intervene? You might think we don't have a basis for that on this view. Let's just look at one more. If you thought the virtue theory was self-serving, there's one that is much more self-serving. And that's what we might call egoism. Morality of an action is determined by whether or not it fulfills one's own needs, desires, goals, etc. On this view, you think, well, look, what's right is what gets me ahead. What's right is what gets me further down the path of achieving what I want. Fuck everybody else. What do you think of this view? Yeah.
It's I wouldn't say it's the best for making friends or relationships.
Not the best for making friends or relationships? Yeah, I mean, do you want to be friends with somebody who thinks like this and just throws you under the bus, you know?
What if your goal is to make more friends and all that stuff? What if your goals are to see a better world where there's less suffering and more happiness?
Yeah, then what do you all think? Let's say I'm an egoist. But my true desire, I get really happy when other people are happy. So I just want to make everybody around me happy. But I'm doing it because that's what I want. Is that bad? Is that good? Is there a problem with that?
Well, what if your goal is to gain as much influence as you can to, change as many people's lives?
Yeah. Positively or negatively?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's good to be like that, like want everyone to be happy, but that's not realistic. Like most people are not going to be like that. They're going to want to put themselves above others.
Yeah. We certainly seem to, you might say, act like this a lot, right? But maybe this is the best view. Maybe this is what we should all be doing. Everybody looking out for number one.
Is there a view that's kind of like it's not what you talked about where you want to see everybody happy, but you want to see your goals, your friends' goals, your parents, like everybody around you, their goals? Is there for that?
I mean, that could kind of be made compatible with any of these first four views. You'd have to clarify a little bit further. But I mean, virtue theory would say, yeah, work on yourself. You'll naturally craft a good life for yourself and people around you and your society. Ethics of care, one of the things that it says is good and that we should care about in our lives is being partial to people. We should care more for the people that are close to us than strangers. Whereas utilitarianism would say everybody's happiness is equal in this calculus that I'm doing about what actions to perform. So partiality is in the ethics of care. You might say partiality is also in virtue theory. There are more views than this about what makes an action right or wrong. But you should reflect on this, especially if you're going into the business world, making deals. You should reflect on this. I've given you a bunch of tools here to analyze your actions in your life. How should you live? How should you treat the people around you? What kind of obligations do you have? Do you have an obligation, like Peter Singer, famous utilitarian, might say, an equal obligation to people across the world as you do to people right in your vicinity? Or do you have more of an obligation to your friends and family members? Should you be completely outward-facing in your actions, doing everything you can for others, for society, like utilitarianism might say you should? Or should you be more inward-facing, like virtue theory? Because, look, the good things for society will come once you've sorted your shit out. Well, unsurprisingly, all of this is connected to the second chapter that I asked you all to read for today, which was about justice. So, take a few minutes, talk to the people around you. We'll transition to that chapter. What is justice? What makes an action just? Okay, go for it. Okay. What is justice? What makes an action just or unjust? Yeah?
If it's like equal for everyone, or if it's like morally right.
If it's equal for everyone?
Yeah. And then if it's morally right.
And if it's morally right. Okay, so if you're doing something that's just, it also has to be morally right.
Yeah.
Like, there are no just actions that are morally wrong.
No, actually no.
It doesn't seem like it, right? Aren't just actions like moral actions? Yeah, maybe we think it has to do with morality. Okay, what do the rest of y'all think? Yeah?
I
think for at least what I was thinking was luck can also kind of play into it, because is it really justice that some people are born poor, some people rich, born into different classes, and then, or is it just straight luck? Because even though like if we further like go into that, even if we like have all the money, is it really justice that? Is it really just that some were born poor and some were rich?
That's a good question. What do we see when we look out at the world in our own society? There are inequalities between people and between classes, right? Some people seem to have good luck. They were born into a wealthy family. They're going to go to a good school, right? Some people seem to be born in bad circumstances where they don't have the same opportunities, where they don't have the same capital and resources as another family. So they're going to go to the shitty school down the road, right? Can't even spell. You might think that you weren't born with, the same lucky genes that other people have that make you as smart or as athletic or whatever it is. So that's a good question. Yeah, does justice involve making sure that everybody is born with equal resources?
So there's a quote, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but a while ago I read it. It goes, everybody's born into this world with the equal possibility of an unfair reality.
So we're all basically born into suffering and difficulty.
So it's not that. It says that, everybody has their different things. So someone might be smarter than you, but you might be more athletic than them. And so just because you're born with quote-unquote bad luck by being poor, that doesn't mean you can't move up in the world because of your, brain.
Okay, so if I said we should use the government to make it so that all families have the same amount of money, because that would be just to the kids they're going to have.
Yeah, but that's the same thing as saying...
Would you support that or no?
Well, here's why I would support that. The reason is because think about grades, right? Imagine you are, working really hard for an A, and then someone is just there sitting on the phone the entire time and they get an F, and your counselor comes to you and says, well, we have to average out the grades, so he gets a C and you get a C, even though he did nothing.
Yeah, grade equity. Yeah, redistributing the points, right? Would that be unfair?
Maybe a little, but not like...
Well, there is this idea of fairness that we associate with justice, right? What's fair? Normally, people agree that whatever justice is, it has to do with these things that we call rights, right? Protecting people's rights, enforcing them. We might think it has to do with equality of opportunity. And some people think that, justice also has to do with socioeconomic distribution of resources. So, if one family doesn't have the same amount of capital or resources as another, if there's not equity in this domain, there's something unjust going on. Nagel is pretty straightforward in this chapter that, look, unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect society. Generally, we agree that whatever justice is, we think that if there are such inequalities, if they're caused by things like discrimination, or if they're caused by theft or fraud, or if they're caused in some other way by a violation of someone's rights, that's unjust or that's unfair. But what the proper, just response to these inequalities is, it's something that's a matter of fierce debate. So, unsurprisingly, many thinkers over the last few thousand years have come up with a lot of views on what justice is, what makes something just, etc. In the Republic, Plato, the greatest work of Western literature of all time, the whole book is about justice. What is justice? How do we make a just society? What kind of rules and laws should we have? How should we educate people if we want a just society? Well, Plato thought that justice is a virtue, kind of similar to Aristotle in a way, that establishes rational order. In other words, what it means for something to be just is each part in a system performing its proper role. Not interfering with the other parts. Now, in the Republic, Plato is infamous, you might say, for arguing for an aristocratic government where there are only a few people in power, the philosophers, obviously, because they're the only ones that know what's going on. They're the only ones with the virtues not to abuse the power. And he envisioned a three-tiered class society where the producers and the merchants and the craftsmen are on the bottom, and then you have the warrior police, that are the second level, and then you have the philosopher kings. And everybody performing their proper role in their class, caste-like system, that's going to produce a just society. And he had an economic argument as well, such that he thought the philosopher kings never get to handle any money. They get paid just enough to survive, to rule the city and make the laws. It's the craftsmen and the producers and the people on the bottom that get like all of the economic benefits of making the stuff, because they're the ones that are doing it. They should be able to have a luxurious life. The philosopher kings, they're not going to actually be treated like kings with purple royal cushions and stuff. What do we think of this view of society? Three-tiered class society. Everybody, is in their proper place, doing their proper thing. Yay or nay? Sawyer?
I see one issue.
Yeah?
This is under the assumption that the philosopher kings are completely morally good.
Yeah.
And they're going to become jealous of those who have more than them.
Plato says they won't, but you might be like, yeah, okay, nice pipe dream you have, buddy. Right? Do we want a classed society? Is that good? Is that just?
I mean, it's kind of how every society works. In an ideal world, it works, but that can be said about every other kind of form of rule that we see.
Okay. Okay, well let's imagine we're trying to construct the just society. John Rawls, famous 20th century thinker, came up with a thought experiment for this. He said, imagine yourself behind what he called a veil of ignorance. You don't know anything about yourself. You don't know your history. You don't know your age. You don't know your gender or sex. You don't know your skin color. But you're creating a society that you're going to live in. If you didn't know anything about yourself, how would you construct that society so that things are most just and most fair? Well, he says you wouldn't make any discriminatory laws, right? You would try to allow people to have a certain level of freedom because you don't know where you're going to end up in this society. You might be in lower classes, you might be upper classes. So he thought that justice is maximum equal liberty regarding basic rights and duties. And if there are inequalities, there can be inequalities, artificial inequalities that the government actually creates, provided it's for maximum benefit for all. And of course, we need equal opportunity for people. I'll just put one more theory on the board. I have several of them. You can look at them when I upload the teaching notes. This seems like a good kind of democratic, liberal conception of justice. Nozick thought this was not the proper view of justice. He took a more libertarian conception. Justice involves having a minimal state, protection of rights, especially property, and respecting voluntary exchanges. So if inequalities develop by exchanges and transactions that are not coercive or violate people's rights, it's totally fine. If inequalities result, say, from, the person who's a CEO making a bunch of money and then leveraging that to make more money and other people don't have as much, he's like, if it results from free and voluntary exchanges that are not coercive, totally fine. The government shouldn't get involved in redistributing wealth. We only interfere with people's rights where there's violation of rights. So what do you think? Do any of these kind of capture what you think of justice? Or maybe you want to take a different view. Maybe you think, no, I'm actually more of a socialist. I think the government should have a larger role in determining and redistributing wealth and opportunities for people because voluntary exchanges lead to inequalities and bad luck for people. What do you think? Let's say you were born in a middle-class family. You're able to go to a good school, get a good job, you're making $150K a year. Should the government tax you more because you make more money because there are people less well off and redistribute it to them, or no? What do you think? Do you want social welfare programs? Are those good? Are those just? See a lot of people nodding. We want to help people. Well, what's the just way to do that? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go back to my point about the it's fair if you work hard for something and then it has to be distributed. But
Okay.
there is also two truths can be the same at the same, like true at the same time.
Like it would be good to help people, but also we shouldn't take people's
Yeah,
stuff that they earned,
so-
maybe.
But it just kind of amplifies who you are.
Yeah.
So if you're a piece of crap, then if you have more money, if you have more responsibilities in the world, you're just going to be a bigger piece of crap. Versus if you help people when you already had nothing.
Yeah.
And if you have everything, then you can by yourself distribute.
Okay.
So if we just raise people's conscience and people's willingness to forego their own greed, then I think that would be better.
Yeah, all of these questions about, what should the role of government be? How big should it be? Do we want a democracy or something else? Do we want, a dictatorship? What kind of laws and policies we have? Should we do anything about wealth distribution and capital distribution? All of these are concerned with justice. So you should reflect on, what kind of government do you want to live under? What do you want to participate in? What do you want to support? Because you live in a society that does all this kind of stuff, okay? All right. Any questions? Otherwise, y'all can get your butts out of here. When you have time, look at the other views that are going to be on my teaching notes that I'm going to upload, okay? All right. Have a good weekend, everybody.